Okay, hello everyone. David Adler, President of AJA here, and you also see on the screen Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, and someone by the name of Glenn Druery, who I will introduce in just a minute. This video is all about the forthcoming election, and in particular, the dynamics of how the election works. We've heard people ask questions, some confused, some wanting more information about preferences, about what results might occur in particularly the seats with the significant Jewish communities. And Glenn Druery, who you see on your screen, has a nickname called the Preference Whisperer. He's regarded as one of, if not the expert on the dynamics of how the ballots work. Glenn, so pleased that you can join us today. For those who are not familiar with you, can you just say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, and thanks for asking me on, David. What I do is help minor parties and independents navigate the sometimes murky and shady world of electoral negotiations. The major parties have professionals helping them, and they don't want minor parties nor independents getting in the way. So my role over the past 20 years is to help ordinary Australians, mums and dads, the people that teach your kids at school, the people you buy your coffee from, enter parliaments. And that's exactly what's happened. Now, the major parties don't necessarily like that. And they've been following me around with a legislative broom and dustpan and changing legislation to stop me doing that. In fact, they've changed legislation at least 6 times to stop me helping ordinary people enter parliaments around this country. And since I've been helping ordinary people enter parliament since 1999, an independent or a minor party has had the balance of power somewhere in a parliament in this country, and they do today in some parliaments right now.
Glenn, one of the basic elements of confusion is who actually controls preferences. I mean, if a political party says that, oh, we're going to preference this other political party, some people think that, well, that happens automatically, that party A can direct preferences to party B. What's the actual situation? How does it work?
Well, you're right. Party A can direct preferences to party B and C and D and so on, all the way down the line. And that's called the group voting ticket. Now, that only exists in the upper house in the state of Victoria. It used to be the situation where that was how we voted in the Senate in New South Wales, in Western Australia and South Australia and so on. And of course, this is some of these things that the major parties have taken away these tools which help new parties get established. Without the group voting ticket, we would never have had the Democrats. We would never have had the Greens. We would never have had Nick Xenophon. And all of those groups, whether you agree with their politics or not, have made a contribution to the political scene in Australia. Now, that group voting ticket, or the single transferable vote method, only exists in the upper house of Victoria. What we're about to see in the Senate in the upcoming election is a type of a preferential voting called optional, or sometimes we have compulsory preferential voting in the lower house. And that means, coming back to your question, who controls preferences? What the voter does. When the voter picks up their pen or their pencil, it's what's going on between their brain and their hand and what numbers they fill in, what boxes they tick. Now, a major party or a minor party or an independent can recommend through a how to vote card who you should vote for. And the Greens, for example, might say, vote 1 Greens, vote 2, a range of left-wing small parties, and they might end up parking their vote or sending or recommending to you, the voter, that you put the Labor Party before the Liberal Party. And we know from experience, we know from history, that roughly 60 to 70% of those that vote 1 Green end up sending their preferences to the ALP. We know that. And similarly, on the other side, we know from history that One Nation voters, roughly 60 to 65% of those voters will vote for the coalition or for the LNP before they will vote for the Labor Party. So just going through that again, how would that work? If I'm handing out for One Nation, God forbid, and that recommends one for One Nation. Ultimately would recommend a smaller number for the Liberal or the National Party candidate than it would the Labor Party candidate. But I just want to reinforce, it is the voter that controls their own preferences, nobody else.
I think that's the key message,
Yes.
Glenn, what you said at the end, that, I mean, to put a crazy scenario, if I wanted to vote number one, One Nation, number two, Greens.
And I can assure you, I've scrutinized for years. Yeah. I've seen that.
Yeah, but
I've seen people that vote One Nation, Greens, or vice versa.
I mean, that's entirely up to me, up to the voter to
yes,
do
it
if they wish. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Well, let's turn our minds now to the 2022 federal election. It looks like it's going to be a particularly interesting one because there is some disenchantment with both major parties, I think. We have Clive Palmer spending mega bucks on promoting the UAP.
Probably more than any other political party has ever spent.
And also claims to be the largest political party by members. I'm not sure what it means to be a member. Maybe it's just tick a box on.
In 20 plus years in politics, I've seen a lot of claims.
Yeah. And we have a number of other minor parties, some ex-Liberals who've joined the Liberal Democrat Party, such as Campbell Newman in Queensland. David Limbrick is standing in for them in the Senate. They've got a couple of prominent people. John Ruddock in New South Wales, yes. Ex-Liberal devotee. And of course, we've got these climate independence group, Climate 200. Do you see it as a particularly complicated election shaping up?
I certainly see it as an interesting election. And I would tend to agree with you that the feeling toward the major parties is waning somewhat. And we can see that, again, historically. When I first started doing what I'm doing with minor parties and independents over 20 years ago, you know, at any given election, you'd see 10 to 15% of voters that would vote for parties other than the majors. Now it's consistent that we will see 25 to 30% and more in some places. So I think we're certainly going to see that at this election. Really, the issue comes back to, at the end of the day, whether a minor party or an independent can win. Something that I've been working on for years is helping them understand their strategic pathway forward. And until they get that, then they're not going to win. Now, you mentioned the Climate 200 group.
Yeah.
I have had conversations with a number of these. They'll give me a call and ask what they need to do to win. And my answer is whatever it takes. You are up against some of the best Machiavelli minds in the country. And unless you are prepared to do what you have to do to win within the law, of course, you will not win. A lot of candidates, particularly independents, think that because they put their name down on that ballot paper, that their God is smiling on them or somebody's smiling on them and that they're just going to win. Well, they're not. They have to, what I like to say is play the game. And I think one thing that's going to let down many of these independents is their holier than thou attitude in dealing with other groups. In other words, I get this. I'm not preferencing anybody. Okay. Right. Unless you think you can get 50% plus one, you will not win. You just won't win. So there's a lot of talk about these independents winning seats everywhere. It's just not going to happen. We might see a couple pop up. We're seeing challenges in seats like North Sydney, like Wentworth, like Goldstein, and a whole range of other seats. Some prominent in Julie Banks, in Julie Bishop's seat, former seat in Western Australia, and many other seats around the country. We've got these prominent independents backed by Holmes a Court, who's the son of the one-time richest man in the country, and he's a nice guy. I've met with Simon, but he doesn't understand the finesse of making this work. So I repeat, we're not going to see a whole swag of independents win seats. We might see 1, 2, 3, 4. That's about it.
Okay, well, you mentioned two seats that we're particularly interested in because there are some of those climate independents standing in Wentworth, which is the Sydney
Yeah.
seat that has the largest Jewish community in New South Wales, and Goldstein in Melbourne, you mentioned, which has the second largest Jewish community in Melbourne. So I'd be very interested in your analysis of any additional comments you can make about those seats.
Okay, if we're going to talk about a particular seat, can we bring up some numbers to have a look
Okay.
at? Do you want to start with Wentworth, or?
Yeah, we have Wentworth on the screen now.
All right. Can we just bring that up so we can see the two candidate preferred result down the bottom, just a little bit?
There it is.
There we go. And just down so we can see Dave Sharma's primary at the top. There we go. That's got it all. All right. Well, there, of course, the results from last time, and we can see if we go right up the top. Let's start at the basic stuff. The Liberal candidate and sitting member Dave Sharma, who by the way is a really nice guy at a personal level, and quite popular in the electorate.
He is. He's got a very good reputation within our community. I mean, he's obviously ex-ambassador to Israel, and he's done the work in the community over the last few years that I think will hold him in good stead.
I think he'll be hard to beat. I really do. So if we look at those numbers last time, let's just talk the basic stuff. And I apologise if some of your viewers understand this, but I've had conversations with members of parliament, with members of cabinet members, and they don't understand some of the things that I'm about to talk about. So if you're happy for me to start with the basic stuff, we'll do that. Is that okay?
Oh, please do.
All right, we look at the top there, Dave Sharma, his primary vote, and we'll just round off at 47%. That's the primary vote. Karen Phelps' primary vote at 32%, and the Labor Party candidate at roughly 11%. So nobody's a clear winner there. Nobody has pulled 50% plus one. So what do we have to do to get a winner? We distribute preferences. Now, we talked earlier about preferences, but this is how they work. Let's start at the bottom with the Christian Democrats candidate there on their 346 primary votes. Now, I don't know the dynamic of what happened on the day, so we'll just talk in principle as to what usually happens. So the Christian Democrats might have some people in the electorate handing out a how to vote card, and on that how to vote card, it will say, put a 1 next to their candidate, their candidate, and the Christian Democrats usually go straight to the coalition. So it's very likely, unless they went through some minor parties, that they would have a 1 next to the Christian Democrats' name and then a 2 next to the Liberal candidate's name. Now, we know historically that Christian Democrat voters are fairly disciplined, and they tend to follow the how to vote card even better than the Greens. And I've seen up to 80% of those votes, those Christian Democrats voters, follow that how to vote card. So we could likely assume that probably 300 of those primary votes from the Christian Democrats, at least 300, very likely flowed to the Liberal candidate, Dave Sharma. You with me so far?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, now similarly, we could go up the ticket. So we start with the bottom, we eliminate the person with the smallest primary vote first, we distribute their preferences. So I've just said the majority probably flowed to the Liberals, and then you get other preferences, which is like a shotgun. They just go all over the place. So some certainly would have gone to Labor, some would have gone to the Greens, but the majority go to Liberals. So then we deal with the independent. Now, I don't know that independent. I don't know their politics. I don't know where their preferences went, but the same principle applies. They would have gone up the ticket. And as I say, I can't comment on where they went. But if we get to the UAP there, the United Australia Party candidate, and that's a very small primary vote for the money that Guy spent, but that's another story. The United Australia Party pulled roughly 3 to 3.5% across the board around the country. And we know from analysing those numbers that approximately 65% of that 3 to 3.5% went to the Liberal National Party around the country. So I think we can assume that of that 625 primaries, somewhere between 50 and 70% of that very likely flowed up the ticket to the Liberal candidate. Now we get to the other side, to the Greens. And again, historically, we know that the Greens voters are quite disciplined, not quite as disciplined as the Christian Democrats, but nevertheless, they're right up there. and that somewhere around 60 to 70% of that, I will just round here, 6,700 primaries, the majority of that would have gone to the Labor Party candidate. So what have we got? We go down to this to the two-party preferred. After distribution of preferences, we've got clearly Dave Sharma is well ahead there on roughly 60%, with Labor on 40%. But that's not the end of the game here, because, and it's not really demonstrated here in detail, but I can tell you that Karen Phelps was after preference distribution, she was, well, it actually is distributed, represented, was further up the tree than Tim Murray, which meant that Tim Murray, or the Labor Party candidate, fell over. And then we had another distribution of preferences. And we get to what we've got at the bottom there on the two candidate preferred, with Dave Sharma over 50%. So enough preferences has flowed to Dave for him to win, to get to roughly 51%, and Karen Phelps on about 48.7% there. So is that a clear explanation as to how they work in a lower house seat? Is there anything you'd like me to touch on there?
No, I think that is clear. It's a cascade until you get to the last two standing.
Yeah,
and
we start at the bottom with the smallest, and we just go up the ticket. So further to your first question, nobody controls these preferences other than the voter. If I'm that Christian Democrats voter and I come in, yes, I will be given a piece of paper to recommend a certain way to vote. But at the end of the day, it's what I do as a voter that's important. It's the order of those numbers and where those numbers end up. I'm the one, the voter. You, the voters, are the ones that control your preferences.
So is it until the last two that are standing, or until someone crosses the 50% threshold?
It's until somebody gets 50% plus one.
So there might still be three standing. So it's important the order of...
No, look, at the end of the day, preferences will just keep on going, and it always comes down to, the last two standing. So for somebody to win, for an independent, for example, to win, this is a tough one. I mean, theoretically, if somebody pulls 49.99%, an independent, anybody else can win because they haven't hit that 50% mark. But in all reality, that's not going to happen. So just looking at these numbers at 47.5% roughly, that's a tough one for an independent or somebody else to knock off there. Of course, it's theoretically possible, but in all reality, you've got to see that, and it's even thin oxygen at these numbers, that primary vote of the lead candidate is somewhere south of 45%, and their challenger, certainly, it's doable in the 20%, but it's tough. Somewhere up in the high 20s to low 30s, and then they've got to get a very good flow of preferences to knock off that lead candidate. Now we see that in seats like Indi in Victoria. We've seen seats over the years, many seats over the years, where the person that comes third in some cases can actually win if they get a really good flow of preferences.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. So based on that analysis, if Dave Sharma holds something close to the primary vote that he got last time, and instead of Karen Phelps, we have Allegra Spender substituting in here, she might get something of the order of Karen Phelps, then we could well look at a similar dynamic in Wentworth that occurred at the last election, and Dave Sharma, starting with a reasonably high primary, will cross the line over 50%.
I think it's very likely if he pulls anywhere near that number last time of 45% plus. Of course, if this isn't science we're talking about, this is art, really. Political science, I think, is a misnomer. I think anything over 45%, while it's possible he could lose, unlikely he'll win.
Okay, well, let's have a quick look at Goldstein, if I can bring that up. Just take me a few seconds. Which one's this? This Goldstein? Yeah. So this is Goldstein from 2019. Same chart.
So we can see there that Tim Wilson won without preferences. His primary vote there of roughly 52,000 or over 50%. So it's 52.67%. He's won that seat. So we don't have to go to preference distribution. Will things be different this time? Depends on what polls you look at, depends on who you talk to. My gut tells me that Tim will need preferences to win this time. How far down that slippery pole he falls, well, you know, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't answer that.
I can see what you're saying. That there'd have to be a significant swing against the Liberal Party. By significant, you know, according to what you said previously, you know, 5, 6, 7% swing.
I think we'd have to see the better part of, you know, 8% swing against him. Now we saw that, look at those numbers there, that he had a swing of 3.66% against him at the last election. You know, we could ask the rhetorical question of, do you think that the coalition will be the same, will be greater, or will be less than they pulled last time?
Who knows?
That may come some way to answering the question is, can Tim hold on? It will be interesting. We know that the Labor Party are very keen to preference Zoe Daniel. The Greens will probably preference the independent candidate too, because you've got to understand, while the Labor Party and the Greens may not necessarily like a given independent, they'd rather have an independent there than a sitting member of the coalition.
Yeah.
And so if you are an independent and you're running in a seat and the ALP thinks, or you can convince the ALP that you're going to pull somewhere over 25 toward 35%, then they will preference you.
Yeah.
And they will pressure the Greens if the Greens need pressuring, and they will preference you too.
Glenn, it could be a bit of a different dynamic thinking about it. It depends how big an issue this, you know, climate change is in Goldstein. I can't answer that. Tim Wilson is one of the group of Liberals who does push climate change policies.
Tim is a moderate.
Yeah, if there's a feeling there that climate change is important and they need to express that through Zoe Daniel, it does introduce a dynamic that wasn't there on the last election. But I think your analysis makes a lot of sense, that Tim Wilson is pretty solid prospect, unless, you know, some major thing we don't see happens in that electorate.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it will be tough for an independent to knock.
Robert, you wanted to have a quick look at Macnamara. Although one of the Climate 200s is not standing in Macnamara, it is actually the seat in Melbourne with the largest Jewish community, and the Greens have been making a push at it for some time.
Yeah,
so
there's a lot of people very worried in the community, to be represented by the Greens. So.
Well, there's the 2019 results for Macnamara, Glenn.
Okay, so Josh Burns is an up-and-coming star in the Labor Party. Macnamara, formerly Melbourne Ports, historically rock-solid working class, and inner city Melbourne. And like the seat of Melbourne, we see the Greens' primary vote over recent elections has been steadily increasing. And yes, Robert, you're right. I think this will be potentially, could be a three-way race for this seat. Although I think that the Liberals are absolutely an outside chance. If that Labor Party primary, we see last time that Labor Party primary of roughly 32% slips, and if the Greens primary goes up and they exchange places, that is, if the Greens can get ahead of the ALP with preference flows, of course, then they stand a real chance of winning. So if we look at the other candidates that ran in that election, and we assume it's something similar to that this time. Of course, Rise Up Australia doesn't exist anymore. They were ultra right-wing Christian group. Sustainable Australia, 1%, not much to speak of there. United Australia Party, again, not much. Animal Justice. Animal Justice are an interesting bunch if you analyse their preferences. When Mark Pearson was first elected to the New South Wales Parliament a couple of terms ago, I did have a look at the preferences that went to animal justice, and we saw an unprecedented, which really surprised me, of about 15% of Liberal Party voters preference the Animal Justice Party. Many people think that they're just a hardcore left-wing organisation. That's not necessarily the case. So we can't necessarily, I bring that up because people will think, oh, animal justice will go straight to the Greens. No, they won't. They'll certainly probably favour the Greens, but a lot will go to the Labor Party and less so to the Liberal Party. So if we have a group similar to this, there's not a big field of preferences for the Greens to scoop into. So I come back to my earlier statement. For the Greens to have any chance at all of winning this seat, they're going to have to narrow that margin of roughly 25% to 32%. And if they can get ahead of the ALP, they're in the game.
All right. Thank you so much, Glenn. Now, just before we let you go, we're not going to bring up numbers for this, but I'd be very interested in any wisdom you can impart about the Senate and whether you think the composition of the Senate is going to change significantly, whether the minors that we've been talking about have any show in the Senate or not. How do you see the Senate falling?
I can go through all the states if you want, or I can just give you a general view. How would you prefer that?
Let's go Eastern Seaboard.
We'll start with Queensland.
Yeah.
I think Queensland will very likely see 3 from the left, and that will probably be 2 Labor and a Green. Of course, if you talk to the Labor Party, they want 3, and but I just can't see that happening. So it's very likely 3 and 1 there. On the other side, there's a very interesting battle. Certainly we'll have 2 LNP. Now that last spot, you talk to One Nation, Pauline's got it. She's got it. And probably, most likely she will. But for a numbers geek such as myself, I think I'd like to see an interesting battle. If Pauline gets a bad draw, we haven't talked about draws, the draw is where you appear on the ballot paper, and that's out of everybody's hands. That's a random blind thing with tickets, balls coming out of a lotto type thing. Sure. So if Pauline gets a bad draw and say Campbell Newman, for argument's sake, it's the donkey vote, that's the first position, then we know from history that where the Liberal Democrats get a good position on the ballot paper, there is a lot of voter confusion. And we saw that in the 2013 election when David Leyonhjelm, the Liberal Democrats senator, received the donkey vote in New South Wales, and their primary vote was nearly 10%. Now that was unprecedented. I thought when I saw those numbers coming in early in the night, I thought there was a mistake. I thought that we'd had one booth somewhere, perhaps where David lived, and convinced all his neighbours to vote for him. But no, that's what happened. So if we get a situation where the Liberal Democrats in Queensland, with Campbell Newman, a former premier, wasn't the most popular guy in the world, but understand with a good preference flow, 5 or 6, 7% could be enough to get you there, depending on the dynamic between you and what's left with the other major party. So if he gets that donkey vote, Pauline gets a bad draw, and I don't think Clive's really in the game, but we may see a situation where that last seat in Queensland could be under the right circumstances, a battle between the third LNP, between Pauline Hanson, Liberal Democrats, and an outsider, Clive Palmer. So I'm going to have a bob several ways and say that last spot in Queensland could be a really good one to watch.
I think that's going to be the contest of the contest of the Senate.
And I think your dog agrees with me.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to New South Wales and Victoria quickly.
Okay, New South Wales, again, we'll probably see we'll certainly will see 3 progressive candidates, probably 2 Labor and a Green, maybe 3 Labor, but one of
Okay.
those 2.
Okay,
That's a
pretty
given.
clear.
And again, the interesting one in New South Wales, there'll be 2, a Lib and a Nat, or 2 coalition. That last spot, where's that going to go? I mean, how much is the Liberal Party, if any, are they going to fall off the twig in their primary vote from last time? If they fall just a couple of percent, then that last spot in New South Wales could potentially be open to, again, if the Liberal Democrats get a good draw, if they can get preferences from the Labor Party and others, then maybe they're in the game there as well. Clive Palmer, I doubt it. I'm going to make a bold prediction now that Palmer won't win anything anywhere. Craig
A lot of
Kelly,
money to
Clive,
invest for that, right?
it is a lot of money to invest, but you've got to understand, be careful what I say here. Clive is very quick to pick up the lawyers. In my view, Clive's not in this to win seats. Look at what happened last time. I said earlier that Clive across the country pulled roughly between 3 and 4% across the country, and roughly 60 to 65% of that flowed to the LNP, to the Lib Nats everywhere. Clive didn't want Shorten to win at the last election, and he used his money and his influence to help achieve that. And I think something similar is in Clive's mind now. However, we saw at the National Press Club just a few days ago, where Clive perhaps sees the writing on the wall. Perhaps he's realised that ScoMo won't have another one of his miracles and win this election. So what happens to Clive and his strategy if he preferences the Lib Nats everywhere in the country and Labor wins? What influence will Clive have then? Perhaps you should get him on to ask that question. So coming back to New South Wales, I think it'll be 3 on the progressive side, obviously 3 on the right, but that last spot, that's an interesting one. And I think it could be fought over, will certainly be fought over between the 3rd coalition candidate, possibly Lib Dems if they get a good draw. Can One Nation get there if they get the donkey?
No, not New South Wales.
Do they even
Probably
have
not.
candidates yet? Have they announced any for the Senate?
Oh, one thing that did happen overnight is George Christensen has announced that he is running for One Nation.
Oh, wow.
Now he could win. He could win. He's
In the Senate?
No, in the lower house.
Okay. Fascinating. I didn't know that. Okay.
No, well, I woke up to that on my newsfeed, so I don't know much more than that at this point.
Okay.
He will certainly won't be preferenced by the ALP. They will preference the LNP before they go to One Nation. So unless he can get there with a massive personal vote, it'll be interesting to watch. So coming back to the Senate, we look at Victoria. Again, it will be 3 on the progressive side, very likely 2 Labor and a Green. Could be 3 Labor if the swing's on, but probably 2 Labor and a Green. What's going to happen on the other side? Last time we saw 3 Liberals elected, and the Liberals from memory, don't cane me if I get these percentages not quite right, but I think the Liberals were on roughly 2.5 to 2.6 quota. Now, a quota is just a fancy word to say how much do I need to win a seat? And in the case of the Senate, there are 6 positions available in any given state, except for the territories, where there's 2. And the way to figure out the quota is take that number 6, add 1, which is 7, divide 7 into 100, and we come up with a magic figure of 14.29%, or roughly 14.3%. And that theoretically is what you need to win a seat. However, the last spot usually, sometimes the last 2 spots are usually for somewhat complex or simple mathematical reasons can be unquoted. And that last spot on the right will be unquoted. We'll probably see the coalition come in at something under 2.5 quota, probably closer to 2.3 or 2.4 quota. Now, if a minor party can get ahead of that, and I think the race there, again, dependent on the draw, could well be David Limbrick from the Liberal Democratic Party if he gets a good draw. And I repeat, he must get that good draw. That is, he's got to be the left-hand side of the Liberal Party, and as close as possible to that donkey vote, that 1st or 2nd spot. If that happens, I mentioned earlier, we saw a huge vote for David Leyonhjelm of nearly 10%. Will that happen in Victoria? Probably not. But if David Limbrick can get himself on the Labor Party how to vote card for the Senate, plus the donkey vote, plus that name, maybe he might move from the upper house of Victoria to Canberra as a senator. Who else can win it down there? Well, we saw Darren Hinch win 2 elections ago, where he did get the donkey vote and his primary vote was roughly 6%. Of course, that was a double dissolution election.
Yeah.
And at the last election, his primary vote slipped somewhat. But after preferences, Darren's primary vote was roughly 100,000 primaries. He was the only guy in the country preferenced by the ALP before the Greens. In other words, the Labor Party recommended a 1 for their own candidate and then a 2 for Darren Hinch. And then I think they went to the Greens after that. He also got himself on the Liberal Party, had a vote card, and the Greens. So he was the only one on all
Amazing.
3. Yes, it was. Thank you. I ran his preferences. And that turned Darren's primary vote of 100,000 into roughly 300,000. Now, we haven't seen anything like that since the days of the group voting ticket, but it wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough. The Liberal Party candidate was something over half a quota, and Darren was like that person drowning off Bondi with his hand in the air, and just not enough lifesavers got to him, and he sank electorally. But I bring this up with Darren because I think he's really the only other one, apart from the Liberal Democrats, that have got a chance. And it will come back to the draw. If either of those 2 groups get a good draw, and if the Liberal Party, the coalition's primary, falls off a few percent, then that last spot in Victoria could be an interesting one to watch as well.
Well, Glenn, thank you. You've actually made some moderately clear guideline type predictions, not always specific, but you can't, nobody can. There are.
It's political art, remember. If anyone tells you they're a political scientist.
So thank you so much for your time. Robert, do you have anything you want to add at this stage, or we just wrap up?
No, that's everything. It's been very informative, so thank you for that.
Okay. Glenn, thank you so much for your time. I hope it'll be informative and of interest and useful for our audience. Thank you again.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for asking me on.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay.